Hi everyone, it's Nichol for Simon Says Stamp with a couple of sympathy cards featuring coloring directly on background stamps with water-based markers before spritzing that with water and stamping it on watercolor cardstock. It's a great way to get multicolored backgrounds by simply coloring your stamp first and reactivating that ink with water and then stamping it on your paper. And it gives you beautiful custom watercolor looking backgrounds. I'm going to use two different backgrounds from Simon Says Stamp today. The first is the folk dance background, which is one of the newer backgrounds from Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to trim down some Canson watercolor cardstock to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And I'm going to place it in my MISTI. I've got a little adhesive on the paper in my MISTI. I've removed the foam insert since I'm using a cling stamp here. I don't need the foam insert, but I've positioned it not clear up in the corner. That way I'm going to easily be able to stamp the entire background, and the adhesive that temporarily adheres it means that I can keep re-stamping this as many times as I need to, and it's not going to go anywhere. Then I'm simply coloring in my stamp. This does take a little bit of time, but really I did both cards in one afternoon where I did not have a lot of time. So even though it seems a little time consuming as you're doing it, I think it's probably not any more time than coloring a bunch of images and putting, let's say, a scene card together or something like that. So these actually did come together a lot faster than I thought they might. I am using Tombow dual brush markers for my images here, and I'm going to color in part of my background, spritz this with water from a mini mister. I chose the mini mister over a distress sprayer because it gives a really fine mist. And then I am going to press this into my watercolor cardstock really good and then lift it up and move it over. Now, part of the reason I did not do the entire background at once, in fact, that didn't stamp that great, so I went ahead and spritzed it with water again without recoloring and pressed it into my paper again, and I got a much better result. Part of the reason I did small sections at a time was because if I did this entire A2 sized background, if I colored this big stamp, colored the whole thing, and then tried to stamp it, I think I would have a little bit of trouble, even though you're reactivating the ink with water, getting a good stamped impression. For me, it was a lot easier to work in small areas, spritz it with water, stamp it, and move on. What I did to make it easier to know where I had already been, instead of cleaning my stamp in between, I would just kind of blot it dry with a rag, and it's still stained with my markers, so I knew where I had already colored. I would just color another section, spritz it with water, press that down in place, and then move on to the next. So see, I'm just blotting dry, and then we're going to move on. So I'm going to go ahead and do that area to the left of where I've already stamped, but you can see the beautiful, beautiful background we're getting. Two colors for any greenery. I'm using mint and green. The color numbers are shown across the screen as well as the actual colors. The center of the flowers and the dots are chartreuse, and then the flowers themselves are a combination of orange and a red. I lay down the orange first, and then I'm just kind of flicking in a little bit of red coming out from the center. And that's what's going to give this pattern. So look at your background stamps, especially since that's what I'm doing here today is mostly background stamps. I'm going to show you this technique also on clear stamps so that it gives you an idea of how you can do this for not only our red rubber background stamps but our accents as well. But I think for backgrounds especially, this is a fantastic technique and a great way to create our own watercolor looking pattern papers with the stamps that we have. I like to just color in with my lighter color, add a little bit of darker color, spritz it with water, and let the water do the magic part of this, which is the mixing of the colors. The imperfection of the stamp design is what is so magical about this. If some of it is lighter than others, if some of it doesn't blend as well as others, whatever it might be, that's okay. That is the look we're going for here. We are not going for the perfect stamped image. Watercoloring is oftentimes very imperfect, and that definitely is the look we want to do. Now, instead of doing two backgrounds exactly the same, I thought it would be great to show this with a couple of different backgrounds. You definitely could do this with many different ones, but I went with florals. I'm working on sympathy cards today, restocking sympathy cards that I have in my stash so that I have them available to send out when needed. They are never my favorite cards to make. So I think it's important to have those cards on hand so that when emotions are high and you need that card and you need to be able to send one out, I like to have them available. And unfortunately, recently I've had to mail out quite a few sympathy cards. And so it's been great to start restocking those. If you don't need sympathy cards, you could consider doing this for any occasion, anniversaries, birthdays, depending on what kind of background it is, holiday cards. It doesn't matter. This is an awesome technique that works with lots of things, but I chose florals. I think they're a good standard for sympathy or thinking of you type of cards. And I think it would be fun to explore this technique with lots of different color combinations as well. Now, I stuck with the exact same color combination that I used on the folk dance background for this modern rose blooms stamp. This was part of a Simon Says stamp card kit here a couple months ago. It's also available for individual purchase. It is a gorgeous background. When I started with that folk dance background, I really thought it would be my favorite. I think the modern roses became even more so. I love this technique with this stamp. So beautiful. I love the small flowers. Definitely just kind of work in a small area is my best tip for this technique, and work your way out. So I would kind of go and do a whole bunch of roses with the orange and the red. Then I would go in with mint and green and fill in the greenery. And then for all the little dots, I would fill in with chartreuse. Spritz this with my mini mister, press that down in place, and then move on to the next area. And I could see, you can really hear is a good idea of a big spot where I missed. I missed some coloring or whatever, so I can just go in, fill that in, and stamp it again. This is a great technique for kind of imperfect backgrounds, if you will, but still super pretty. I love that it looks like a custom watercolored background, but it was created completely with stamps and markers. These water-based markers are what makes this magical because they are reacting with the water. I have not tried this technique with alcohol ink-based markers or anything like that. I really prefer water-based markers with this technique. It's something I haven't done in quite a while, so it was really fun revisiting one of these favorite techniques from years ago, for me anyway. So very fun. Let's fill in that bottom edge, and now we have our backgrounds. I did let these both air dry completely before moving on. So I've got some scraps of white cardstock here, and I decided to take some sentiments from the W+9 Sympathy Lilies stamp set, and we're going to stamp the scripty word prayers from this set with Simon Says stamp mint ink. And then we are going to stamp You Are In My, and then the long phrase from the same stamp set around the word prayers with JELLYBEAN ink. This helps keep the whole design really soft and serene, I feel. Instead of stamping anything with a black ink or even a dark gray or something, I think would kind of detract or take away from the feeling of the card. So be very conscientious of the colors you're choosing for your sentiments. I'm using the Misty so that I could stamp the word prayers especially more than once, one on top of another. so it gets a really good stamped impression. The rest of the sentiment, I really didn't need to stamp more than once, but it still helps me be able to line up these phrases really easily. I'm using a little clear ruler here made for the original Misty. I'm just kind of making it work for the mini Misty, but lining up my other phrases around this, and I can stamp all of the rest of it with one press then. And I'm going to go ahead and create both of my text or sentiment blocks at once. And then we'll just trim those out. Nothing special as far as no die cutting. You could totally die cut these into a label shape or something if you wanted to. I am just going to trim these down into simple rectangles that I can adhere right to my watercolored backgrounds with a little foam adhesive that will help pop them up off of a busy background. So there's what my greeting looks like. We're going to grab our paper trimmer and just trim this out. I didn't even really measure it, you guys. I really just kind of eyeballed it and trimmed it up. And I love these soft, pretty colors. And there's what it's going to look like on that folk dance background. Instead of just leaving the sentiment directly on the background, which you totally could, this would make a gorgeous card, maybe add a few sequins or something like that, I decided to add some florals. And we're going to use the Simon Says Stamp Bold Florals stamp set. We're going to use the flower from this that kind of matches the folk dance background that we just created. I think that flower really matches nicely. We're going to use a couple of leaves and then like a little sprig of greenery from this stamp set for the first card. And again, I want these to match the look and feel of our background. So instead of stamping them with a solid color ink, which you could do, I'm going to instead color them in just like I did the background. So the flower colored with orange and red. And unfortunately, I see that I'm a little bit out of frame, so it's hard to see me coloring. Please just imagine me coloring in those stamps. I'm sorry about that, you guys. Just like I did for the background, spritzing this with water from a distress, or from the mini mister, not the distress sprayer, the mini mister, I'm sorry, and then pressing this into a little scrap of watercolor cardstock. Again, I did use watercolor cardstock. I think that you get much better results because watercolor cardstock is made to work really well with water products, so it's going to stand up much better. That one leaf did not transfer that great, so I'm just adding a little additional color, spraying that again, and we'll just press that again down in place to get the little bit more of a defined leaf. You can work that as many times as you need to, and that looks much better. Once these are dry, I'm going to take the Coordinating Bold Flowers dies and die cut those flowers and leaves. So let's put the first card together, adding some Scotch foam adhesive to the back of our sentiment rectangle. And a little different placement for me anyway. I don't often put my sentiments down near the bottom. I tend to gravitate towards putting things up in the upper third or upper half of a card when designing something like this. I decided to position this down at the bottom, and I really like it. We're going to have our flowers kind of tucked over on the top right, slightly overlapping our text block and then slightly up above. And to help them really be visible from such a busy background, I'm going to adhere everything with foam adhesive. So I used the Scotch foam adhesive for the sentiment, and we're going to use scrapbook adhesives, foam adhesive squares for everything else. And just trying to figure out my perfect placement for everything. The one leaf I adhered with some glue dots because it's really right on top of the already dimensional sentiment block. Then we'll put some foam adhesive on the back of the other leaf and tuck it underneath. And then some foam adhesive back behind the other leaf, or the little spray there. Now, originally I thought I'd just do a whole bunch of little dots in the center of this flower, and I did not like how it looked at all. So before it dried, I just picked it up with my finger. And I'm going to just put a little or a little bit bigger drop in the center to finish that off. It felt like it needed something in the center, and that was some Nuvo crystal drops in Ripened Pumpkin. Let's attach this whole panel to a top fold card base. I'm going to put some nice strong adhesive right on my card base and then pop my panel or my background right down there. And because this is watercolor cardstock, it really stood up to all of that water. You can see it did not warp all that much. Really beautiful, and finished that card off so nicely. Let's go ahead and do our second background. The only difference here, both styles of cards are exactly the same. It's just the background stamp that we did differently. The colors are all the same. I decided to switch up the flower for this one to a rose that would match the feel of our background a little bit better than the flower we just used for the folk dance card. And this one is more of a rose. You can see me coloring these stamps a little bit better. So unlike the last card where I was off camera, this time you can see coloring in those clear stamps, pressing this into our watercolor cardstock. Again, that leaf didn't really stamp all that well. I'm going to take my green marker and just add a little bit more ink to that and stamp it again before cleaning off my stamp or these stamps, and I can put those away and die cut these bold flowers and attach them to the second card. So not only does this technique of coloring directly on your stamps work for cling or rubber-based background stamps or any cling type of solid stamp image, but you can use it for your clear stamps as well. A mini mister really gives that really fine mist of water that is so great for this technique. I highly recommend a mister like that rather than our distress sprayers, which tend to put out those bigger droplets of water. And I like to die cut my images, hold them in place with a little post-it tape. Make sure your images are dry so that your tape doesn't stick to them and maybe tear them or anything like that. We will put this second card together just like the first, and this is going to give you two fantastic sympathy cards or thinking of you cards, friendship cards, whatever it might be. Please remember that you can make these kind of cards, and these backgrounds will work for all different styles of cards, not just specifically sympathy like I needed here, but you could make these work for anything. So if you've got floral lovers, maybe some birthday cards coming up, this would be awesome for that as well. I think floral cards are always one of those great kind of universal designs that work for lots and lots of different occasions. I considered putting that one up at the top, but ultimately I really like the placement down at the bottom, so we went with that again. Thank you guys so much for joining me today for these two coloring on stamps with water-based markers cards. The supplies I used to create my cards are listed and linked below the video here on YouTube. Here are a couple more videos featuring Simon Says stamps and dies that you might be interested in. Thank you guys so much for joining me today, and we'll see you next time.